And this is Glenn Hammond Curtis, the AEA, and the John Newton Williams helicopter of 1908. Most of this presentation is 1908 through about 1919. And across the bottom of the screen is Glenn Hammond Curtis, whom you all know. There's the AEA, and there is Mr. Williams. All three pretty much intertwined as I go through this, and you'll see why, hopefully. Here is John Newton Williams. Best photos I could find of him. 1896. He's shown at age 56. 2 years later. That's how he appears in most of the photos in this presentation, is the 1898 photos. He was originally an engineer entrepreneur hailing from Derby, Connecticut, and he was working as a jobber. Really, he was very good technically. He was almost a mechanical engineer, but he had no formal education. Very, very good with mechanical items and products. And in fact, as the screen says here, he would eventually invent the Williams typewriter. If you go online and look at the history of typewriters, the Williams typewriter is considered one of the best. It was a real quality item, and his company that he formed was in Derby, Connecticut. But it was in early 1900, he said, I'm going to look at the helicopter. And he invested about $4,000 of his own money to build a helicopter. And as this presentation will show you, in 1908, his first primitive helicopter with a Curtiss motor would be the first machine to lift a man vertically in America. Here's a photo of the Williams typewriter. Again, it was really considered to be a quality machine. He sold quite a bit of them. That's how he got the finances initially to do a lot of this. Here's his 1905 helicopter model. Last time I knew, it was still on display in the New England Air Museum. And this is what he did with that model. Here he is launching his model in 1905. Here's the model in flight. And here he is retrieving his model. But the search for power. He initially, after completing his machine, reached out to Curtiss. Curtiss sent him the 4-cylinder machine or engine. I will show you that engine later, that was used on a lot of the dirigibles. But Williams found that to be unsatisfactory. It just didn't have enough power. It was 20 horsepower. So he goes to Hammondsport to use this V8 motor, which was used on the AEA aerodromes and the Williams helicopter. And a little bit about the motor later here. And I just want to mention this helicopter power required curve, because all these early inventors didn't realize it, but when they look at the power required for a helicopter at hover is really where a lot of it is required. Here's the power required curve. As they transition to forward flight, they get all of that nasty air out of the nasty air from the induced power. Goes way down, and eventually they're going to hit parasite power requirements. So it's going to eliminate how fast they're going to go forward. But here they are, all these early inventors, whether it's Williams or Sikorsky or Bell or any of them, all trying to hover at tethered flight. And they're way over here where the power requirements are some of the greatest. And I just show you, they have no idea what they were up against. I mentioned he arrived in Hammondsport with his helicopter in January 1908. It was at the invitation of Glenn Curtiss, but he found that the AEA members busy with their first airplane, the Red Wing. And I'll just show you some of their aircraft here in a minute. But they immediately began testing the helicopter. And I just mentioned down here, Alexander Graham Bell, who was the president of the AEA, he says, the AEA was a cooperative scientific association, not for gain, but for the love of the art and doing what we can to help one another. Unlike the Wright brothers, who, were working in absolute secrecy. And, they refused to work in secret. And they were openly supported others in the aviation R&D efforts. Here is the members of the Aerial Experiment Association, organized in September 1907. And again, a couple of Canadians, but you see Glenn Hammond Curtis on the left, and he was really their engineering guru. Well, he was the technical guy, really. You look over here, here is Thomas Selfridge, who really was probably the most knowledgeable at the time, as a member of the group in aeronautics, because he was really studying aeronautics. Regretfully, he'd lose his life in September of 1908 with the Wright Flyer, because he was part of the Army's acceptance testing at Fort Myer. Here's what they were sharing the engine with, and you can see the engine on the red wing. Because Selfridge was recognized as one of the experts, he got to build the first aircraft, but it had no lateral stability. Unlike the white wing, which followed in May, which did have some small wings or ailerons, which did give it some lateral stability, which proved to be a lot more successful because the red wing crashed on its first flight, where the white wing made a couple. Finally, the engine was used in June on the June bug, and there'll be more about the June bug here in a little bit. But the lateral stability was greatly improved with ailerons, unlike the Wrights who were using wing warping. Here's the simple coaxial design of the Williams helicopter. And here it's shown at Kingsley Flats, where there's I think it's a high school down there now. It's school property. But the rotors themselves were tilted panels constructed of plywood, driven by a motor resting on a simple platform. And you can see the simple platform. And here is the Curtiss V8 engine. Williams claimed its low center of gravity assured automatic stability and perfect balance. It cannot be capsized, the operator having only to regulate the motor and steer the machine. Steering and control would be accomplished by the operator, who was Byron Brown, sliding a small movable chair, thus changing the balance of the machine and tilting the rotors. I am quite positive it probably would have crashed on its first flight. That would have been almost impossible to control. Here is his patent, filed in January 30th, 1907. But this table gives you the dimensional data. You can see the size of the rotor. Also, with the engine installed, the engine weighed 145 pounds really, but wet 150, horsepower of 40, operating rate of 485. What's unique is up here, the top mast was a folded parachute inside a cylinder for emergency situations, i.e. the stopping of the motor. That would have been very, very interesting. Obviously never used. Here he is, John Newton Williams at Hammondsport, inside the old dirigible balloon building. This is where he assembled his helicopter. And again, there sits the Curtiss V8 engine. Here is a publicity photo of John Newton Williams with the Curtiss V8. Notice the cooling fins on the flywheel. The lightweight engine, typically engines today are in engine blocks. Not the case here. These are in cast iron cylinders, the pistons are, to keep the weight light. Also, the oil pan, it's a splash system, it's aluminum oil pan. Here is your exhaust system. I can imagine the tremendous noise it made. And again, there'll be more about this flywheel and the cooling fins, okay, a little bit later here. Here's a description of the engine in the 1908 edition of Aeronautics magazine, which was frequently at Hammondsport. If you go online and you look at Aeronautics magazine, there were a lot of different reports coming out of Hammondsport at the time, where there was the dirigible, the helicopter, the airplanes. But this went into some detail on the air-cooled engine, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but I will mention, it weighed 140 pounds. Okay. Here he is, again, another photo of the Williams inside the dirigible hangar with his unassembled helicopter. There's the engine again sitting there on the floor. Quite a unique building in itself. Here is a photo. It is considered to be the first private aerodrome in in America. A large wooden building, 40 by 75 feet, 27 feet high. And it was constructed in 1906, as it says, by Captain Thomas Baldwin in Hammondsport. Baldwin was another one that showed up in Hammondsport looking for Curtiss engines, the Curtiss Power. Typically, he was using that four-cylinder engine, which I'll mention here in a minute. But here is Mr. Baldwin. He had early in the late 1800s, he had hot air balloons. He was a parachutist. He'd parachute out of the balloons on different exhibitions, but they eventually got into dirigibles. And later on, he'd actually build his own airplane using Curtiss Power. But again, I just quite a building, which is obviously now long gone. There's the building here in this photo. And as I mentioned, here is the Baldwin dirigible that he brought to Hammondsport. And I show this because here's Curtiss, probably really got him started, in aviation or flying anyway. Here he is flying on Thursday, June 28th, 1907. And for a Thursday, a middle of the week, look how formal everybody's dressed. Most of these photos, the gentlemen are all in ties. Here is Curtiss holding that lightweight four-cylinder engine, 20 horsepower, used for the dirigibles. And again, this is the same engine that, excuse me, the John Newton Williams used before he came to Hammondsport to try to power his helicopter, but found it unsatisfactory. It just did not have the power. Here he is outside the dirigible hangar. And this is probably January timeframe. It's probably some of the first time he's tried to fire up the engine with his helicopter. And you can see it blurry, so the blades are spinning. Here is a letter. Williams was encouraged by the initial testing. In a letter to his son Milton, he states, quote, "Your good letter reached me tonight at supper. Awful glad to hear from you. Have just written to Mama and must scramble to get this off on next mail. This afternoon made most encouraging test. New 8-cylinder motor in place in machine and 5 pounds added. And think we can tune it up and trim machine so it will lift me. This is the first motor in the world to lift a helicopter of man-carrying size with 50 pounds added weight. I am much encouraged and relieved. More soon as the testing progresses. Lovingly, Papa." Okay, I just share that way. And here is Glenn Hammond Curtiss. He's tending the machine. He's got his back to the camera. Here he is now. And this is the day that actually they were able to lift the machine. Excuse me, they were able to lift the man on the machine. I'll show you another photo of that. Here is Selfridge. Again, the AEA was very involved with the testing. Here's Selfridge in the front in the white shirt. Here's Glenn Hammond Curtiss over here on the right side, again tending the engine. You can see the smoke. Okay. I love this photo personally. When I visited the museum back in 2013, 14, when I was working on this paper, this photo came out of the archives. It's the original photo. And, you can see where John Newton Williams, this is his actual writing on that photo. This is a real treasure. Williams' helicopter lifted this young man several times, several inches, several times. Trials witnessed by Alexander Graham Bell, Lieutenant Selfridge, Augustus Post, and many others. Curtiss used this same motor in his first 3 airplanes, winning the Scientific America Cup on July 4th, 1908. Signed J. Newton Williams. Photo taken by Glenn H. Curtiss at Hammondsport. Okay. The writing on the back of the photo said Hammondsport, Kingsley's Flats, also dirigibles flown here, which I just showed you. Cold Creek, which flows into the Cayuga Lake. I would just like to share a witness. This is from a witness to that day. Attached to the top of the vertical shafts are two propeller type arrangements. Oh, they always called these propellers. They weren't rotors back in the day. Possibly 10 feet or more in diameter. These were fashioned from bamboo with plywood vanes, so arranged that when revolved, both exerted a lifting force, although turning in opposite directions. The platform was secured to the earth by 3 ropes extending to stakes driven into the ground. When I arrived on the scene, someone who I believe was Jay Cook was busily engaged trying to crank the motor by grasping the rim of the motor flywheel. This flywheel is an innovation to me, as the rim was a piece of flat steel with rounded edges about 2 inches wide and 5/8 inches thick, with wire spokes, not unlike a motorcycle wheel. It was perhaps 18 inches in diameter, built to give a force with a minimum of weight. Again, there was no electric starter on these motors. You started this motor by cranking on that or spinning that flywheel. The weakness of the contraption appeared to be the clutch, which, when loosely adjusted, would not transmit the full power of the motor to the rotors. When tightened to turn the rotors, with significant drag to make difficult the cranking and impede the starting. Mr. Cook was really sweating trying to turn the motor fast enough to start it with a tightened clutch and rotor drag. I recall that he had blistered his hands in his exertions, and during a lull, while someone was making a clutch adjustment, he turned his palms up to look at the blisters. Among the spectators was Seymour Hubbs, who had driven his auto to the scene, was wearing a pair of black gauntlet gloves, which in those days was a must for every auto driver. He saw the condition of Cook's hands and promptly passed the gloves to him with a hearty invitation. Jay, use these. The lengthening shadows warned me that I was responsible for certain chores at my father's place of business, and I reluctantly left the scene. The next day I inquired and learned that the clutch was finally adjusted and the platform and operator were airborne as far as the ropes permitted several times. So I just thought that was pretty unique, that witness account. And again, this is out of the Aeronautics magazine. This is June 1908, and it talks about the private trials where they witnessed lifting a man clear of the ground. But its shaft, again, there was a springing of one of the shafts. The transmission had developed some weakness, and it was going to be replaced by heavier and stronger parts. And it was expected that the machine be ready for future trials, but this never happened. Okay, it did not happen in Hammondsport anyway. It would happen later on here, which I will show you. Before we leave Hammondsport, again, there's the June bug with Curtis at the controls. This is July 4th, 1908, the day he won the Scientific American Cup. John Newton Williams was still there, and he would witness the event as he indicated on that previous photo. Again, the Scientific America Cup, they had reached out to the Wright brothers because they heard that the Wright brothers, had made several flights of considerable distance, but the Wright brothers said, no, we're not going to compete. We're going to keep this a secret. But Glenn Hammond Curtis did, and he won the trophy. And there it is. There he is in flight, and there's a photo of the trophy. Here is a letter dated July 16th, or an excerpt from it, 1908, in which Alexander Graham Bell informed Williams, I hope someday to be able to congratulate you upon the successful conclusion of the experience you have so long and so patiently been involved in. He was much surprised by the evidence of great lift obtained by your helicopter, and I have no doubt that you will ultimately be successful. And again, before we leave the AEA, who did help Mr. Williams, they were quite an innovative group. They had a giant man-carrying kite, built a hang glider, 4 increasingly sophisticated aircraft. I showed you 3 of them, and advanced several key aeronautical innovations. Ailerons. They were the first ones to really use ailerons, the little wings that would provide the lateral stability. They used a tricycle landing gear and eventually a liquid-cooled aviation engine in the Silver Dart. So again, you look at a modern airplane today, and a lot of these have the tricycle landing gear. They're using airlines. They're not using the Wright brothers wing warping. There is the 50 horsepower V8 engine. It weighed 165 pounds, which was used later on. And again, to keep the engine light, you can see the copper water jackets that surrounded the cast iron cylinders. I just showed you that. It's in a museum now in Ottawa, Canada. John Newton Williams helicopter in Washington, D.C. He would leave Hammondsport and he would link up with Berliner, Emil Berliner, in 1909 down in Washington, D.C. And maybe some of you recall the Berliner. He was famous in the late 1800s for his inventions with gramophones, phonographs, telephone transmitters. Founded the United States Gramophone Company in 1894. And that was the basis for a lot of his wealth, that he could do this. And again, much like Williams, he said, I'm going to start exploring this helicopter phenomenon. Many of the popular helicopter histories list that Hammondsport helicopter, as I showed you, as a joint Berliner-Williams case. But I've got to emphasize this was not the case. In a letter dated May 16th, 1909, and signed Berliner, he indicates, the words down here, I have been the last few years been at work separately on what is known as the helicopter problem. That Hammondsport helicopter was not a joint effort. You go online, you Google, and so much of the stuff you find online says, hey, it was a Berliner Williams helicopter. And that's the danger with a lot of research trying to Google online. You got to go back to source documents and find the original stuff. Okay, so I just emphasize that. Here he is. Here he is on the right. He's down now with Berliner. It's in Washington, D.C. at 1909, and you can see it's a larger helicopter. And there's two engines in place down here. I'll show you the engines. They were rotary engines now, the Adams Farewell rotary engines, 35 horsepower each, 70 total horsepower. And you can see now it's a larger 18 feet 8 inches, the rotor diameter. Empty weight was 460 pounds, operating rate 610 pounds. And again, here's a photo from his patent, filed on January 30th, 1907. Here is a photo of that Adams Farrell engine used on the Williams 1909 helicopter, and it's on display in the Smithsonian Institution. Final trials, they did several trials conducted June 26, 1909 at Berliner's farm using those star-shaped 5-cylinder motors. Again, the configuration, well, again, it was increased. Berliner's helicopter was 16 feet 6 inches, but they increased Williams' design. They used his design of 18 feet 8 inches, which increased the solidity of the system up to 80 square feet. But the larger rotors did slow the RPM down to 120, because of the drag on the system. But it was successful in the fact that it did lift Mr. Williams standing on the platform on 3 separate occasions, according to the documentation, but regretfully, no pictures exist to substantiate this claim. Okay, people in the past have asked me, okay, Berliner's farm was 1458 Columbia Road. What's there today? That's what's there today. Williams would leave Berliner, and he left the helicopter there. And he went on to pursue other things. Berliner did not. He went on to do twin rotor helicopters. Here's 1922 on the left and 1924 on the right. They look like airplane. And again, the rotors look more like propellers. But before we leave Berliner, I just wanted to make sure or state the fact that they're considered the 1922 flights were the first by manned helicopters, and the 1924 machine is considered to be one of the first truly vertical, flyable, piloted aircraft. I mean, it could leave its tethers and it could maneuver. He left Berliner. He'd exhausted his funds. Who, as I said, Berliner would continue in 1910 with his experimentation, and he used making two similar versions of his own, but he went on to build that 1922 and 1924 machine. Williams in 1910 to 1915 began inventing and building motorcycles. Okay. He became really fascinated with the potential uses of rotary engines, and he would design and build 4 different motorcycle models using the rotary engines. And these were in the rear wheel, which I will show you photos of. To start these machines, there were floorboards that were also the starting mechanism, which the operator had to pump like an old treadle mill sewing machine. Only a small type or prototypes were ever made. He was never really able to go into full production. Here he is in 1912, mounted on his motorcycle, and you can see the rear wheel where the engine's mounted with that 3-cylinder rotary engine. He's at the Adams Company in Iowa. Here is one of the last known Williams motorcycle. It's a 1915 model. And it was at the Glenn Hammond Curtis Museum in Hammondsport when I visited there in 2014. I don't think it's there anymore because the museum did not own it. It was owned by a private individual, and I think they took it back. Not sure. New York Rotary Motor Company. From 1917 to 1919, Williams, along with his 2 sons, who became more involved with his father's efforts, Milton Sanborn and Newton Halstead, would turn their design and construction to tri-cars now. And again, single rear wheel provided the power using the same 3-cylinder rotary 4-stroke engines. And it was basically a box built over the front wheels, and it housed a seat for passengers, or without a seat, could transport merchandise and cargo around the crowded streets of New York City. Okay, and they did form the New York Rotary Motor Company. Here is the Williams Tri-Car. And again, the idea was to use it for deliveries around the city. You can see the motor installed in the rear. Now Williams says, I'm going back to helicopters. It's the summer of 1917. Quote, I decided the submarine situation demanded a revival of my helicopter work. Because, as you recall, back in 1917, the United States was engaged in fighting World War I, and there was quite a loss to U.S. shipping to the German U-boats. And there's a German U-boat photo below. In October 6 of 1917, Williams was able to show the U.S. Navy a model and description of a proposed helicopter, and he succeeded in securing a Navy endorsement of the helicopter. And in the November-December timeframe of 1917, work was started. He formed the Williams Aircraft Company on March 4th, 1918, and he completed his helicopter in July 1918. But his history would show the Williams Aircraft Company concept of the use of helicopters in anti-submarine warfare was a concept that was well ahead of its time. Again, here is the patent filed July 14th, 1910. This is after he had left Berliner. patented October 28th, 1913. Again, he's going to depend on this parachute up in the mast. This unique helicopter was 22 feet. They keep getting larger. Solidity went from 80 to 105 square feet. Again, the same basic rotor RPM of 200. The engine was a Lerone rotary engine of 80 horsepower, and it was provided by the U.S. Navy. Again, the Navy had become interested. Before we go to the next photo, though, I just want to emphasize there is a supposed steering mechanism, a steering control, this bar, which connected by a series of wires to the bottom rotating wing assembly, which caused wing warping to change the pitch in the blades, which theoretically would help with control. I mean, it was no longer balanced, so you would swivel supposedly left or right based on the warping of the lower wing. That was the concept anyway. Here it is. There is his son. It was very similar in construction to Hammond's port machine. Again, the Navy had supplied the 80 horsepower Lerone rotary engine. Again, with the wing warping control system, with this operator control system, you can see his son with his hand on the control system. On July 14th, 1918, his first trial one was completed, and it did lift his son a few inches. And it was tested over a 4-week period, lifting his son several inches several times, but free flight was never achieved. Okay. And again, these are Williams' comments on the bottom, showing guy wires on the lower blades, operated by his son, with his hand on the control for the same. This is the second full-size machine made by John Newton Williams. Here it is in operation, obviously, because of the blurred rotors on the top. And again, this is John Newton Williams, what he has written on the photograph. Williams helicopter propellers turning, driven by 80 horsepower Lerone motor, Northport, Long Island, September 1917. In a letter dated January 31st, 1918, Williams would again hear from Alexander Graham Bell. I am very glad to have your letter of October 20th, which was received here in my absence, to know that the Navy Department is taking to your helicopter. There is no doubt at all in my mind that the helicopter principle will find practical application, and I shall always be interested to hear of your experiments. But armistice ending World War I was signed on November 11th, 1918, and with this, the Navy no longer needed to pursue this project, and Williams Aircraft Company would never sell a helicopter or take it through further research and development. Here is a Williams quote. Having been doing experimental and developing work for some years and have exhausted my financial resources and am no promoter. You can see that, he would invent stuff, but never really got it through into production and sold anything. My only income is my pension check as a Civil War veteran. He'd retire in 1924 at the age of 84. And in 1926, he moved to Bethel, Connecticut to reside at Maple Shade Farm, his farm where he would die at the age of 88. On February 14th, 1926, he's interred at Fairmount Cemetery in Newark, New Jersey. God bless him. His two sons, though, did attempt to support further efforts with the helicopter. Milton Sanborn tried to renew interest in his father's helicopters. He reached out to Pitcairn of the Autogyro Company, it was in Philadelphia, and Igor Sikorsky, the Sikorsky Aircraft Corporation. Also, he went to the War Department. Numerous letters exist and other correspondence exist, especially the 1935 to 39 time frame, but his efforts failed to generate any support. His younger son, Newton Halstead, which you saw in the photos there, assisted his father with the helicopters, and again, he was shown in those photographs. Byron Bosworth Brown, he was the young man that was first lifted in vertical flight in the United States to that 3-foot tethered hover back on May 22nd, 1908. Byron was born in Hammondsport and later worked for the Curtiss Aeroplane and Motor Company at Hammondsport and at Buffalo, where Curtiss was building the Jenny later on, supplying World War I aircraft, and finally with the Curtiss Engineering Corporation at Garden City, Long Island. Regretfully, he died at a very young age, 32, after 10 days illness with influenza, the influenza epidemic of 1918, which indeed killed millions of Americans, and God bless him. I show you this original studio camera belonging to Glenn Hammond Curtiss. For those of you who study the life of Glenn Hammond Curtiss, you know he loved photography. He took a lot of photographs, and Alexander Graham Bell was adamant about it. He says, all of our testing, numerous photographs exist of the AEA, and the Curtiss supported testing, and it was done by Glenn Hammond Curtiss with his camera. And this did exist in the museum when I visited there in 2013, his original camera. And thank goodness he did that. So many of those photos were in the archives at the time. Vertical Flight Society dedicates Hammondsport, New York as a vertical flight heritage site. I wrote this up for the Vertical Flight Society, to nominate Hammondsport as a vertical flight heritage site. And you can see here is called a plaque, if you will, but was installed at Kingsley Flats back in 2019. Okay, and it recognizes John Newton Williams demonstrating rotary wing test rigs at this site known as Kingsley Flats, marking the first significant efforts to develop a helicopter in the United States, powered by an engine designed and built by Glenn Hammond Curtiss and hosted by Alexander Graham Bell's AEA. Williams succeeded in lifting the platform off the ground with Byron Brown. Here is the dedication ceremony. Sorry for the fuzzy photo. I lost the original. But here's the Kingsley Flats plaque dedication on July 6, 2019. That's me on the extreme left holding the umbrellas and the rain that would not stop that day. Here is Ben Johnson, who at the time was the Glenn Curtiss Museum director. Next to him was Rick Leisenring, the museum curator. And here is Mike Hirschberg, our Vertical Flight Society director. We were there for the dedication ceremony, had a great ceremony back in the museum itself. It was a very nice event. I will say this about Mr. Leisenring. He was extremely helpful to me, creating the paper and doing all of this research. There's a real treasure trove of information in the museum archives, and he was instrumental in digging a lot of it out. Thank you, Rick Leisenring. And before I leave Hammondsport, this is my favorite photograph, again, out of the files of the archives. This shows everyone involved during that 1908 time frame. All of the pioneers, seated in the grass is Alexander Graham Bell. He's conversing with Mr. Bedwin, his superintendent back at the Nova Scotia laboratory. Behind them, there's Glenn Curtiss. Behind him, standing, there's Thomas Baldwin again. Remember the dirigible, built the hangar there, had the dirigibles there. And then you have the members of the remaining members of the AEA, Casey Baldwin, Here's Doug McCurdy, and there's Mr. Williams, John Newton Williams. And on the end is Tom Selfridge. I could do a whole paper on Mr. Lieutenant Selfridge, U.S. Army representative, to Hammondsport, whom they welcomed with open arms, the AEA, because of his knowledge. I might mention that, Selfridge wrote to the Wrights several times to be involved in their testing and their research and development, but he was rejected. President Roosevelt at the time reached out to Alexander Graham Bell and said, "Hey, there's a very knowledgeable Army lieutenant, and I'd like to see him involved with all of the AE efforts you're doing." And that's how it kind of came about. But again, he was killed when the Wright Flyer crashed at Fort Myer in September of 1908 during acceptance flights trials at Fort Myer. He was the first person to lose his life in a motorized airplane accident. But that's how I wanted to end this, because they're all pictured here that we talked about in the presentation. I see we have 15 minutes. Any questions? Any questions at all? And again, most of this came from a paper I did, Glenn Hammond Curtis, the AEA, and John Newton Williams, Helicopter of 1908. It was presented at what was then known as the American Helicopter Society's 70th annual forum in Montreal, Quebec.